Okay, why don't we go ahead and get started. Hello, everybody. Can everybody hear me?
I can hear you now.
Wonderful. Well, good afternoon, everybody. Happy Friday. I'm Ali Reza Vahabzadeh with the American Sustainable Business Council. And on behalf of ASBC and all our panelists and partners, I'd like to welcome everybody to today's webinar on opportunity zones for social impact and community benefit. Thank you all for taking the time to join today. We're looking forward to an engaging discussion on building local economies and empowering people. Today, we plan on examining opportunity zones and how we can work collectively to ensure that through the implementation of the policy, we ensure that we are addressing diversity, equity, and inclusion, developing community wealth, strategies to build collaboration, and building local businesses and economies. Before we get started and introduce our speakers, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge our wonderful co-sponsors. We'd like to thank the Business Alliance for Local Living Economies, Social Venture Circle, P3 Markets, and Regenerate. They and others have all been a part of a collaborative effort to explore how we can positively impact the implementation of opportunity zones. For those on the line who don't know the American Sustainable Business Council or are new joiners, I'd like to share that ASBC is a growing coalition of business organizations and companies advancing market solutions and policies to support a vibrant, just, and sustainable economy. Founded in 2009, ASBC and its organizational members represent more than 250,000 businesses across the United States. ASBC's issue agenda is to advance movement toward a sustainable economy, ensuring social and economic issues as well as environmental benefits. And for those of you who are not members of ASBC, we encourage you to get in touch with us so you can become a growing part of our network of responsible companies and business organizations. Our format for today is to hear from our speakers and then to open it up to questions. So with that said, let's introduce our great speakers and begin. Our first speaker is my good colleague, John O'Neill, who's ASBC's Senior Analyst on Tax Policy. John has 12 years of tax-related experience, including 5 years as a tax and budget aide to Senator Ron Wyden of Oregon, the ranking Democrat on the Senate Finance Committee. For 7 years, he worked at the accounting firm Deloitte, educating its partners and clients on federal tax policy changes. Prior to that, he worked as a journalist, writing on topics from financial markets to real estate and development. John will give us a brief on opportunity zones and discuss the principles we're working on at ASBC. Our second speaker is Rachel Riley, Director of Impact Strategy at the Economic Innovation Group, EIG. Rachel leads the organization's work to support communities, policymakers, and investors in their effort to catalyze sustainable economic growth across the country through opportunity zones and other forward-thinking initiatives. Rachel will share her thoughts on investment opportunities around opportunity zones, what EIG is hearing from investors, where they see positive movement forward, and provide context on the regulatory process. Rachel will be followed by Val Redhorse Mole. Val is the Executive Director of Social Venture Circle. Val is of Cherokee ancestry, and Social Venture Circle is a nonprofit organization with 57 years of combined experience, leading the way in the field of social impact, building and galvanizing the business world to create social, economic, and environmental change. Val will discuss core guidelines for impact investors, issues around structuring, and a case study from an impact opportunity zone project. We'll then hear from Juan Saldana III, Managing Principal at P3 Markets. Juan is an international and bilingual business executive focused on building community wealth through public-private ventures. Juan's multidisciplinary career spans over 2 decades working with and leading management teams for financial, corporate, real estate, government, NGO, food industry, and educational institutions. P3 Markets focuses on building community wealth through a public-private partnership model for impact real estate investments. Among the topics that Juan will discuss are where are these opportunity zones, community wealth and structuring, creating a narrative around partnership from a development perspective, and a framework that can be replicated with the involvement of municipalities. And last but not least, we'll then turn to Adam Northrup, financial strategist at Locus Impact Investing. Adam leads product innovation and development, strategy formulation, and capability advancement efforts at Locus Impact Investment and the parent Virginia Community Capital CDFI. At Locus, he provides advisory and investment management services to philanthropic institutions wanting to unlock and deploy financial assets locally. Adam will speak from a local perspective on what he's seeing in Virginia, how there's not enough good impact investable pipeline outside of deep urban settings, lack of smaller projects, and a potential lack of capital. So at this point, I'll hand it over to John. John, please go ahead.
Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me? Are we good?
We can hear you.
Okay, all right. So some quick background on opportunity zones. This is a new effort at tackling poverty, and it was created by the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which was passed, which Republicans passed at the end of 2017. It's under the act. States designate what are called opportunity zones, and they choose these zones from their census tracts, and they're looking for underdeveloped and poor areas. The Treasury has to approve these, but the selection is done by the states. Again, they're designed to drive development and job creation, and their principal means for doing that is that the act cuts capital gains taxes on investments in opportunity zones. To manage those investments, the act also creates what the act calls qualified opportunity funds, right? And so that all the investments that go into the zones that have the capital gains advantages are funneled through or made through qualified opportunity funds. There's an underlying problem with the design of opportunity zones under the act. In particular, capital gains is most typically or often used to encourage the long-term investment in real estate, and that is something substantially short of the kinds of development and jobs that the opportunity zones are meant to create. That requires communities to take as strong a hand as they can in the management of qualified opportunity funds. They have to, the funds are making choices on what they're going to do with their money within the zones. And it's up to the communities to assess this, to identify, to make certain they know what the zones are after, what the investors are after, and to do their best to direct the funds to commit to what they consider their sustainable needs. Our group has been discussing a number of things, but we've agreed on 5 core principles that communities should engage in order to make opportunity zones favorable. You might want to go to the next slide, please, Colton. The first of these is to ensure community engagement, and it needs to be broad engagement. You need local governments, whether it's cities, counties, that sort of thing, to be involved. You need developers to be involved, non-governmental organizations to be involved, and communities can use their local offerings to get a better handle on the process. They can, through the offering of low-income housing tax credits, through the provision of state certification for certain kinds of things, and through additional funding for things like infrastructure to make the investments as productive as possible for achieving the goals that the community has identified for itself. The second of these 5 core principles is to ensure equitable benefits. And at bottom, it requires the opportunity zones, it requires the community to ensure that the opportunity zones are meeting the community's needs for for quality jobs, for housing, to sustain the additional employment, et cetera. And the community can work with can help to direct this with the work with workforce programs and capital access and the incubation of businesses, a commitment to diversity. One of the ideas out there, which I think resonates perfectly for the Opportunity Zone experiment, is the notion of job hub principles. And this essentially means that when you targeting investment, you do your best to match workers to quality jobs, and to provide infrastructure that supports the access of workers to those jobs, and the sustenance and success of the entities where the people are working. The third of these principles is to ensure sustainable practices. And it's important to remember that sustainable practices refers not just to the sorts of jobs that are created, et cetera, but also to the impact of the opportunity zones on the areas where they're active. It's in addition to helping to ensure livable wages, you need to make sure that you're not depriving the people in the community of parks and green spaces, for example. And excuse me. So the fourth of these principles is to ensure transparency, and transparency in this case, because the opportunity funds are so much in charge of what is going to be done, that it's important to get the funds to define up front what their goals are, and to get them to commit those goals as much as possible to the sustainable goals of the community. But then you have to get them to set metrics for achieving those goals, and to have to have them report progress on the pursuit of those goals publicly on a recurring basis, whether it's every half year, every quarter. The transparency is critical to ensuring that the communities maintain the control they have, and to ensuring that the funds stick to the agreement about the sorts of sustainable goals that they have told the community they're going to pursue. And finally, the fifth is to measure outcomes. At bottom, this requires you to know what you want. And one of the ideas we've been talking about is defining wealth, so that wealth is more than just even just wages, right? But it's a larger idea of how do you enrich the community according to your sustainable goals, so that that is what you're pursuing, and that's what you're pressuring the Opportunity Fund to pursue on your behalf. And measuring outcomes, again, it goes back. It's very much related to ensuring transparency. You have to. The communities need to develop for themselves scorecards, ways of evaluating the impact of the projects over time, and scorecards for guiding local stakeholders and municipalities. So this is not a script per se, but it is a set of directions that the community lays out for itself, and modifies over time as necessary. But it's a way of keeping the community keeping itself on track in terms of controlling and directing and pushing for the benefits that it most wants from the experience. That is what I've got. So let's move on. Thanks,
John. Rachel, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you for setting up the atmosphere in which we're at with opportunity zones. I continue to hear a lot of discussion around the need for transparency, for a reporting metric. I get worried when I hear the word control, because I think these need to be community informed decisions as opposed to community controlled decisions. And the reason I'm just gonna put that out there is because I feel like we might be spending a little bit too much time on the front end mechanics and of measuring and monitoring and controlling decision making, as opposed to partnering and really figuring out how we can support these communities who have now come up with a vision, come up with that framework to really connect up to the capital markets and help build the capacity they need to get there and to figure out how to deliver this capital to those communities. It's something that I hear over and over and over again. I'm actually going to share just this week about 5 different conversations I had where I think it's very much in line with what y'all care about, but it's imperative now to start building that connective tissue between communities and the capital markets. And of course, keeping this lens around impact and transparency and informing what good community-led, data-driven investment looks like. But we need to support communities in doing that. So with that, I'll just share a little bit about what the Economic Innovation Group does. We're a bipartisan policy think tank here in Washington, D.C., which we are looking to do the research and create policies necessary to empower investors and entrepreneurs around the nation to forge a more dynamic economy. My role here as the Director of Impact Strategies is to do just that and figuring out how we really are supporting the implementation of opportunity zones by working with communities. Next slide. To give you an update about where we are with the implementation process, I also just want to share that we really view our role here at the Economic Innovation Group as ensuring that that implementation is effective. And so that's the federal implementation, to ensure that states and counties and cities throughout the nation are aligning their resources to support communities and maximize this opportunity zone benefit, and to continue to advocate for transparency. So we were very, very proud to work alongside Cory Booker and Senator Tim Scott over the past year to ensure that the reporting requirements that were originally in the Investing in Opportunity Act were reinstated, and we saw them introduce legislation to do just that and actually expand the original transparency requirements of that bill through a piece of legislation that was introduced in May. We're also working with a coalition of about 80 stakeholders throughout the nation to inform what data collection and monitoring and transparency could look like. We jointly submitted a response to the RFI that Treasury issued on that. And we continue to elevate the extent to which cities and states are working alongside opportunity funds, how they can be attaching covenants or reporting requirements to any additional sources of financing that are needed for those projects and those businesses, most of which need that additional source of financing. The second round of proposed regulations, I think, really opened up the market of interest and capital for investment into businesses. One of the critiques of this has been that this is a real estate play, but really we just needed that clarity in order to get folks moving on the business investment side of it. And we're seeing really good signals there. The other thing I want to highlight is that the White House Opportunity and Revitalization Council, which was formed through an executive order in December, they are up and running, and they've already taken over 100 actions to align federal resources with opportunity zones. I do want to put an asterisk on this and say, I know this is a concern that, only 25% of all total eligible low-income communities were chosen as opportunity zones. And so the fact that we're now aligning and directing more capital to those communities, I know has been a little bit of a sticking point with folks, a concern about creating a vacuum of resources outside the other communities. But I am hearing good things from the recipients of those benefits of the already 100 actions that have been taken, such as EDA grants are now eligible to all opportunity zones. And so that's not an opportunity zone investment that's eligible to receive an EDA grant, even though they can. It's the entire zone. So if you're working within that opportunity zone, you don't necessarily need to be working on the opportunity zone investment transaction in order to benefit from the alignment of these federal resources. Next slide. To go a little bit deeper into the second round of proposed rules, because I do think that it impacts a lot of folks that are on this call today. The second round of proposed rules really address many of the key gating issues and provides clarity needed for investors and fund managers to deploy capital into businesses. Specifically, there was clarity provided around timing requirements for capital deployment, reinvestment, and exits. I know exits is a big concern when you are trying to do a multi-asset portfolio of businesses. It also helps to issue guidance on the application of different tests. So the 50% gross income from active conduct, that 50% test, we saw safe harbors be introduced on that, as well as some clarity around leased property, which I think also helps businesses. And it defined some key terms and provided some additional flexibility, which we're hearing good things from the market, from the actors that we want to be at the table, in saying this clarity is allowing me to move forward with my business plan. Next slide. To give everyone an idea of where we're at with market formation, I'm sure, as you know, there's no requirement for an opportunity fund or an investor to register or get approval from the IRS before operating. So what's been happening is more informal signals to the market. So there's 2 directories that are continuing to be updated as opportunity funds raise their hand and say, I want folks to know that we're raising this capital. And so while I sit here and say more than 130 funds have been launched, and that there's a total aggregate capital raise going on right now of around 29 billion, that is only a piece of the market. The market is much larger. We just can't see it right now. And I think that that goes, again, to the point around the different ways in which EIG and our partners are advocating for additional transparency. Many states are creating platforms or investor exchanges to share information about investment opportunities. So they're not qualifying deals, they're just sharing that information in the hopes to connect with investors and facilitate that flow of information about investable assets and businesses. And other cities are creating opportunity zone investment prospectus documents. And these are really marketing plans, marketing tools that help to elevate to investors that local leadership in those cities are taking opportunity zones seriously, and that there are certain places within the community or transactions or businesses that they are elevating as investable assets to those investors.
That's great, Rachel. Yep. Thank you very much. Sorry to interrupt and cut you short, but just to ensure that all the other speakers and panelists can talk too, I'm going to move it on to Val, and then maybe we can come back to some of your other remarks towards the end, if we have time.
I had 6 great projects to share with you guys, so I look forward to doing that.
Thank you, Rachel. Hi, Val, please go ahead.
Hi, can you hear me?
Loud and clear.
Great. Well, thank you so much for having me here. I'm excited to be here in such great company. Colton, let's go ahead and go to my next slide. What I thought I would do is just explain a little bit of context of who we are and why we have a focus on opportunity zones. And I was thrilled to see some of the people calling in are either members of SVC or related to us in some ecosystem way. So basically, Social Venture Circle is the result of a 2018 merger of 2 of the oldest nonprofits in the social impact space. Social Venture Network was actually started being talked about in the 70s and was formed in the 80s. And then in the 90s, several entities kind of spun out of the grandparent Social Venture Network. One of those entities was Investor Circle, and that particular organization was focused on the facilitation of capital by impact investors into impact businesses. So again, that's a real important key into why we're focused on this particular topic. But they decided to come back together in 2018, and I was hired as the executive director to kind of take us forward into the the next future of what we call the next economy. Next slide, Colton. I wanted to give a snapshot. You'll see our sponsor today, ASBC, actually spun out of us, so we're very closely connected, as well as B Lab and some other important players. You can see some of the companies that were originally facilitated, some of the luminaries like Ben & Jerry's and Seventh Generation. And the reason this is important to what we're talking about today is we have some very strong boots on the ground logistical experience with how the facilitation and structuring of capital works into impact businesses. You can see hundreds of millions of dollars over the years has been facilitated through our network. And so our network is obviously very focused on opportunity zones. They're actually ready to deploy capital. We have businesses that would like to receive some of that capital, but lots and lots of questions around some of the things that John and Rachel have mentioned, as well as the financial structuring. So if we could go to the next slide, Colton. So you've heard some of this, but I'm going to just repeat it because I think it's important. We think the IRS guidance was a little too light originally on impact guidelines. This is around businesses. Now, as Rachel mentioned, they have issued some recent guidelines that are getting a little more specific and a little more detailed. But we again think that they made an assumption that simply by being in an opportunity zone, that is somehow impactful. And we in the social impact space, and I'm sure all of you on the call today know that there are some more stringent guidelines than that. We certainly want more than their current screening, which is certainly no toxic waste and no massage parlors, but that's not, that's simply not enough restrictions. I, as the executive director, am a member of the US Impact Investing Alliance, and there's several of my ecosystem partners are in that. It's housed in the Ford Foundation, and a couple of folks there, Fran Siegel and John Cochran, are very, very focused on advocacy around this issue of impact and transparency and reporting. And they're doing a really good job in kind of representing the social impact nonprofit space. And so I encourage people to kind of keep up with their disclosure of that. And at SVC, we agree with their position that we would like to see a little more guidance around impact. And of course, we would always urge our investors to utilize best practices around these investments. If we could go to the next slide. So these, John hit on it in his opening, and I'm not going to spend too much time, but the 5 core principles as it relates to impact businesses, we think just are key. And again, he mentioned them, but it's community engagement, equitable benefit, and that equitable benefit hits on something that Rachel mentioned. When we look at not just the local partners and local programs, but when you talk about financial structuring, responsible exits are extremely important. I'm going to hit on that a little bit more when I talk about some actual structuring, but when you invest into a business, unlike plain real estate, you can't simply give a timeline for when that is the right and opportune moment for an exit. This program is set up for a 10-year horizon to keep your investment in for 10 years to obtain the maximum tax benefit. And that may or may not be the opportune time for an exit for a business. So as Rachel mentioned, we have to make sure there's some opportunity there for the investor to work with the business founders and owners so that there's not a forced acquisition or a forced exit that is detrimental to the community and the business. Transparency, measurement, and outcomes have been mentioned, so I'm not going to go over those. But again, we look at it with that lens of impact and impact within those businesses and those local communities. So next slide, Colton, please. So let's talk about some of the financial structuring considerations that we're focused on. We should consider that opportunity zone investments are basically all equity. So the money coming into the business, and I am going to focus on businesses, is equity. So you have to carefully consider and source the remainder of capital. Rarely does equity finance 100% of your business needs for the life of your business. And again, what I mentioned before, a 10-year time horizon needs to be discussed around exits, and it should really be thought about when you enter into covenants at the beginning of the investment, because you as a founder and you as an investor don't want to get into a situation that is inequitable. We also support the idea of owner purchase as a possible exit strategy with opportunity zones. It seems like because this 10-year time horizon might hit at a point when an acquisition isn't possible, or it's just not the ideal time to exit, then having owner/founder purchase or take out the opportunity zone investor might be a great exit strategy. And we have members in our network that can help with that. They're nonprofits. So it's just a consideration when we think about financial structuring. Colton, if we could have the next slide. I come from a background in investment banking for tribal nations, and opportunity zones remind me of a lot of programs we've dealt with over the years that relate to financing by federal programs designed to help tribes and tribal members with financing businesses on reservations. They have a lot of similarities. And so I have some familiarity with the complexities that can happen, the benefits as well as the detriments. And I just wanted to go over one case study, and I'm going to correct something John said at the beginning. He said I was going to look at an opportunity zone case study. And actually, I'm looking at a case study that I used integrated capital in another situation, but it reminds me of what opportunity zone financing might eventually look like. And I heard Rachel say, you know, there's the EDA grant possibility. Well, that is often the case when you have one piece of your financing coming from a program like this. You still have to think about some of the other programs, and how you integrate all of that capital is a very sort of synchronized process.
Val, sorry, this is Ali Reza. Sorry to interrupt you. Maybe we can come back to the case study during the Q&A and move on with Juan now, if that's okay.
Sure.
Thank you. Juan, please go ahead.
Hello, how's everyone? Thanks so much for being here. I wanted to take a quick minute to give you some context. So I'm a minority developer in real estate that is currently working on the ground with deals here in Chicago. I'd like to take this moment to go back and just introduce a colleague of mine, Jeff Kaplan. We both have been working together on certain projects that have some of these concepts and we're working through currently. So Jeff, go ahead.
Hello, I'm with Nextseed and Nextseed Neighborhood, and we are an alternative finance company really focused on community-driven projects that tell a story and align local capital and local communities with local businesses and local developments. So we've been working closely with Juan and are excited to share some of our work today. And also have a background as an entrepreneur doing urban impact entrepreneurial endeavors.
Excellent. So our first slide here is we wanted to talk about this intersection as an opportunity for traditional real estate developers, the convergence of large investment pools of capital and QLZs that enable hyperlocal markets to come together. I think that if we look at this obviously as an opportunity for each of them individually, but collectively, what we can come to is potentially looking at a new market that can be created through public, private, and community involvement. So next slide, please. So we went up ahead and looked at this. A billionaire ended up winning big. Obviously, we want to make sure that everyone wins. And so I'll go ahead and shift this over to Jeff to talk a little bit about this slide.
Well, this was from a recent piece last week that ProPublica published on really the impact, the economic impact in neighborhoods that were already transitioning from these opportunity zones. And we're seeing this in Houston, and Juan sees it in Chicago, but in neighborhoods where there was already displacement and development, we're seeing the speculation in land values increase 24% to sometimes in some cases doubling because of the opportunity zone legislation. And then the other issue is that we're seeing that a lot of the capital is really going towards real estate investments that probably already would have happened and not going in directly into the small businesses that we all intend for the legislation and the zones to affect. So this was one example of a project in Baltimore that they focused on, where it really wasn't in an underserved neighborhood. They used a loophole with the Clinton empowerment zones to get this this project accepted as a QOZ. So it's just an example of where the capital is going today that we really think we can address and move quickly with on a municipal level.
Okay, next slide, please. Next slide, please. Okay, so we, again, going on the same vein here, we're looking at proximity issues. Most QLZs are not equal opportunities. The most economically desirable zones have the highest risk of community displacement. This is why creating a framework is extremely important. All desirable zones inherit the features of a sound traditional real estate development. And so most developers are going to laser focus their attention on those zones that have the highest probability of success. So we want to make sure that alongside that, certain classes of folks and people from the community are not displaced by it. So we aim to capture impact value by creating some buffer zones within the prospectus to be able to align and develop better strategies for community wealth and social equity. Jeff, do you have anything to add?
Well, no, I think we're, in some ways we're modeling this off of what you've been working on in Chicago with the buffer zones, and looking at that as kind of a template for municipal policy that can happen in these sorts of zones. But I think it'd be helpful for you to speak really quickly to what's going on in Chicago and what you've been doing with those buffer zones.
Yeah, so what's happening is that a lot of the areas that are changing very rapidly are the ones that are sprouting up with new QLZ funds, and so people are buying up property on a speculative basis, just like we mentioned earlier. And so by trying to reverse the trend, what we're trying to say here is that we have to sort of go the other way and figure out the social impact before we go forward with purchasing and developing properties. Next slide, please. So this leads to this concept of creative placemaking. If we're going to look at buffer zones as an opportunity for the local community to grow and create community wealth, we have to also enable developers, large and small, to look at the concept of creative placemaking. So how are QLCs able to actually harness economic value from culture, community, and public art? That's the question, and that is something that we're focused on in Chicago, is looking at making sure that we place real businesses in opportunity zones, and we create opportunities for people to actually purchase commercial real estate. It's part of this whole concept of creating wealth. It comes from either owning homes and or owning commercial real estate. By putting this in the forefront of the process, we're able to look at strategies whereby large developers and minority developers can design opportunities for the local community. So longer-term creation happens through alternative financing and civic-driven design, and we can focus on affordable commercial development, not just affordable housing. I'll have Jeff speak on this for a second.
I think it speaks to the fact that capital markets, especially with QOZs, really do see real estate as a safe asset class, and all the small merchants and businesses are considered highly risky. And there's a specific type of hyper-local business that is connecting to the community, and the proprietor is living in the community, and they have cultural ties to those communities that are adding value that is captured in the real estate, but it's not reflected in the way these funds are invested. So what we're advocating for through policy and through our work together is a small business driven approach to QOZ investing, where a percentage of these funds is going directly into these types of businesses that are proven to add value vertically and horizontally, and do provide access to create not just equity in the business, but to align that equity with the ability to own a piece of the real estate for these merchants.
All right, next slide, please. So we have this new concept of designing community equity. So much like Rachel and much like Val have discussed, it's about really creating sustainable structure. So what if every development had a subdeveloper partner from the neighborhood? That would create a tremendous amount of communication with the local markets, with the local businesses. What if the municipal policy required a percentage of the QLC investments to have a benchmark for local business and local capital? We would figure that some of the benefits and the trade-offs would be that some of these projects would go through a fast-track process for city incentives such as TIF and building permits. and maybe they're probably immediately eligible for city and state grants. So we firmly believe that micro neighborhoods are the true catalyst for innovation and the economic development of larger cities. Looking to invest in the businesses themselves are just as important as the larger projects that are housing all of these different types of real estate. So in a mixed-use project, mixed income project, what we're saying is that we can design community equity through the process of creating intelligent partnerships that favor a long-term approach based on a 10-year requirement of opportunity zones. And so it creates a unique scenario where we can go ahead and start to look at these projects a little bit more deeper, where we can create measurable outcomes and really design and build equity and sustainable models for future growth. Jeff, would you like to add anything to this slide?
Just the idea that the timing with the QOZ really works well with this concept of buffer zones, and we'll get to this later, but if we run out of time, I think what the catalyst for this conversation was really us connecting with Juan between Houston, Chicago, and potentially another city to push forward this concept of buffer zones that would look at the timing and the geography of how this investment is happening, because the QOZs allow for, they have 36 months to double the asset value that is the basis when they go into it. So there really is this lever that allows cities to get in front of the capital by creating procurement incentives and other incentives to allow for this sort of community wealth building development to take priority over capital that's just investing in high-end condos or typical market-driven projects. But we can go on. We'll get
Thank you, Jeff and Juan. That's great. We're gonna move on to Adam now, and then we'll come back to you guys with questions and other comments when Adam's done. Thank you so much.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for having me. I'll be very brief because I think the Q&A is really important in these conversations. As was described up front, I'm just going to share a little bit about what we're doing in Virginia. And as a little bit of background, I'm part of Virginia Community Capital, which is essentially a nonprofit bank / CDFI that lends into distressed communities in Virginia. And when this law came out, we questioned quite a bit. What is our role? We don't typically kind of involve ourselves in the equity piece of the capital stack, but we quickly recognize that, whether we love the policy or feel that it's perfect, it is the sort of the anti-poverty policy at hand at the federal level, and we really need to figure out a way to rally around it and make it make it happen, especially make the headline happen, which is really revitalize the communities, really generate wealth and healthy lives in the communities themselves. And we were having the same conversation with the state and recognized a few of the challenges that you can see on this slide right now. I'm not going to go through them all. I think the biggest, I think the biggest challenge that we recognized is that there's a bit of a supply and demand mismatch in Virginia, meaning we talked to a lot of investors who were, both local, kind of regional and national at the fund level, which Rachel was talking about, who would love to invest in Virginia communities and even in projects with a double or triple bottom line, not necessarily entirely financially return focused, but that there wasn't a pipeline of, quote unquote, shovel ready projects for them to invest in. And even if there wasn't really the connective tissue, especially in some of the rural, the more rural parts of the state or even micropolitan parts of the state. So please flip forward. So we partnered with the state of Virginia. They actually gave us a grant for a couple years to implement a program that's going to focus on trying to land investment in all of the blue spots in Virginia. And go ahead and flip to the next slide. But we were very careful at the outset to say, hey, this is, the outcomes that we want. And starting with the first one was vital for us, which is that this has to be about the community as well as generating some financial returns for investors. I'm not going to go through the rest of these. This is something that was in the press release, and I'm sure this will go out. I'd rather spend time on my last slide, which you can go ahead and flip forward to. So this is what we're actually doing in Virginia, is we've stood up a team of people who, we're calling a market, at least at this point, who are doing three things. One is attracting capital. So flip forward one more to this slide. One aspect of the activity is attracting capital. So we have someone who is essentially full-time talking to high net worth individuals, to family offices, to wealth offices, locally and regionally, but also to the more national level funds that are interested in the type of impact investing that we see afoot, and really pooling and understanding that capital, what they want, what type of risk they're willing to take, what sectors do they want to be in, what kind of geographies, what type of projects, et cetera. The really vital work is that middle work around pipeline development, where we have the bulk of our resources right now, which is in communities themselves, figuring out what's going on and elevating those projects to the eyesight of investors, but also helping curate that pipeline with a lot of technical assistance, getting those projects and business ideas pitch ready for investors, so that we can do the last bucket of activity, which is essentially be a matchmaking function. We'll, through a variety of mechanisms, be bringing together investors and community projects, one of which will be through some large convenings. We'll also do a lot of regional work. We're already starting some very one-on-one work where we see obvious connections. And we'll also have a bit of a digital presence, which is very similar to what some other states have done. Like, for example, Alabama has a very good kind of online exchange, or Colorado, among others. And so that's basically what we're trying to do. We're just getting started. And I will say that I'm pleased to report that even with just a few weeks underneath us, we have a very, we've cast a wide net, but we have a very deep list of ideas, of actual projects, as well as a very fastly growing list of investors who are anxious to sort of get involved and understand what that list looks like. So I'm hopeful that in a few months, we'll be able to report back to groups like you that, some matchmaking is really occurring and that some deals are getting done. For us, that's going to be the ultimate measure of success, are some of these impact investing deals happening? We will both measure the type of impact it could have on the community, and also the capital flows, but without any of these deals getting done, there isn't going to be much to measure. So I'll stop there. I want to be brief because I do think it's worth leaving some time for the group to have Q&A.
Thank you, Adam, and thank you, Rachel, Val, Juan, and Jeff for participating. Yeah, we'd love to open it up to Q&A. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask, and maybe I'll just get started with some questions that have come in online while people have been speaking. So one question came in saying, and whoever wants to take it, please jump in. Are qualified opportunity funds required to consult with local impacted stakeholders, for example, government nonprofits? If not, to what extent are qualified opportunity funds voluntarily adopting the 5 principles the first presenter outlined? Anybody want to take that one?
Yeah, this is John. Whether the extent to which they are required to meet this stuff is negotiable. So we have large sums of money coming in to communities where there are adjacent governments, et cetera, and they may not be required in a clear sense, but local governments have lots of tools at the ready to both enable the funds to do the kinds of things they want to do and to inhibit, so that there are zoning kinds of things and permit kinds of things and that the state can the community can help the fund with and deny the fund. So it's not a there's a lot of potential interplay, and moreover, most of these funds are not coming in with an eye of alienating the community. So there's going to be some inbuilt goodwill that the communities can work with, but the communities aren't without the capacity to apply leverage.
Thanks, John. A question came in for Val. Val, you mentioned that the IRS regulations don't really require that businesses and opportunity zones be true social impact enterprises. How does SVC define social impact in business?
Well, thanks for that question. And that's probably a longer answer than we have time for, but I would say that we view it in similar fashion to some of our ecosystem partners that do actual metrics like B Corp, B Lab, and GIN. But basically, I always like to remind folks that impact is not an asset class, meaning it's not debt or equity. And it's also not a sector like an industry. It is a guidance and a strategy that goes across all asset classes and all sectors. It's also much more than screening. So we mentioned that the IRS did screen out toxic waste and massage parlors, but we think, even though screening is a small part, it should also include extractive mining, no private prisons, no weapons or firearms, no environmental risk whatsoever or negative environmental behavior. We're just way beyond that. No animal welfare issues or putting any animals at jeopardy, no human rights violations. And it's important to also think about supply chain and vendors when we talk about human rights violations. No product safety issues, obviously. So that's screening, but that's a very small part of what we define as social impact, because we look more at proactiveness and intentionality. So just to be very quick, we don't just look at products, we look at the actual companies or businesses' own footprint too, and their own governance and behavior. So things like board diversity, clean tech policies, chemical management, climate change policies, and by that we don't just mean mitigation, but are you doing something to actually improve the climate? Employee policies, and we do a pretty deep dive around that, including things like AI policies for automation. Do you have something to mitigate a loss of employee jobs if you go to an AI policy? Healthy products across all channels. Supply chain, I mentioned before, but it includes human rights, fair trade, and vendor diversity. Water consumption is something we often don't think about, but water usage and water consumption has to absolutely be thought about in some of these local and rural communities. And community engagement is obvious, but we have a history in our network of many businesses that have like a no interview policy, so hiring formerly incarcerated, youth out of foster care, and that type of thing in the community. So I did that very quickly, but I think you get the idea that there's an intentionality around impact businesses that goes way beyond anything that's been defined in the opportunity zone language from the IRS.
That's great. Thank you, Val. Question came in for Rachel. The Opportunity Zone program is well designed for real estate investing. What specifically are the challenges and opportunities for operating businesses?
Well, I will say that opportunity zones has always been a policy meant to spur job growth in communities where the capital markets haven't been going for the past decade. And so there wasn't anything specific in the statute that was designed towards real estate. It was really just a lack of clarity around some of the terms in the statute that needed to be clarified by the IRS and Treasury through the rulemaking process. And so in the second round of regs, we're seeing a lot of that clarity be provided. And so without going through a full list of where we're seeing some flexibility that allows for investments into operating businesses, I would point you to the Novogradac website, because they've done really in-depth analysis around just that. And so I don't think I would be able to do it justice, but novoco.com, so NOVOCO.com, and I'll write it in the chat box as well, is a great resource for understanding that more. Thank you. I see someone already did.
Thanks, Rachel. And maybe this will be the last question before we conclude for Juan and Jeff and Adam, if you want to chime in, please do. The question revolves around the possibility that opportunity zones would raise rent prices and force poorer residents to move elsewhere. They're wondering if and how it will be possible to prevent all the development taking place in opportunity zones from drastically raising rent and housing prices. Are there specific precautions in place to combat this from happening?
This one. Yes, currently there isn't a specific legislation in place to do any of that. Obviously, that's a big cause of concern. Typically, when developments are being proposed, the local elected officials in Chicago, and I imagine they're in Houston as well, sort of have an oversight committee and local community groups that get involved with the development. So this is exactly a wonderful question, tees up a perfectly discussion about these buffer zones. So we do see that there will be probably some level of legislation implemented in these areas that are at the highest risk of displacement. Now, the way to change that and to shift that is that when the new developments come forward, that there is an opportunity for those particular persons that might be affected by the changes to actively participate in the new development. There's enough space, and because of the amount of capital and equity, for example, a resident to go into maybe a smaller unit, but also something that's more functional, or someone that had a business in an old building that needs a lot of work to move into a new space via some of this local syndication processes, just such as NextSeed, and the capital that's being thrown at these opportunity zones.
And I think that question really was what spurred all of us to start connecting. I mean, we think that there was almost no foresight at the displacement when the law was passed. It was just based on raw, data of dollars and movement into these neighborhoods. But I think that this is such an opportunity for cities to lead, and we're excited to test some policy in Houston and Chicago to see if it can become a template for creating the sort of buffer zones that allow for community wealth building and direct investment into small businesses that create equity. And in our own projects, in Juan's project and projects that we're working on with NextSeed, we're really merchandising with a lens towards businesses that have permanent residences in close proximity to the project and or a cultural tie to that neighborhood, because the neighborhoods that Juan and I are both working on are transitioning neighborhoods that were predominantly Mexican immigrants and their second generation families that are being displaced. So we're really trying to invest in businesses that are from the community. And I think that policy that literally said that a developer committing to 15% or some number of all of the businesses in the project get some procurement incentive is the sort of policy that we're exploring.
Thank you, Jeff. Colton, maybe you can put up the last slide with everybody's contact information. That way, if any of our participants want to get in touch with anybody, they know how to do so.
There you go.
But thank you so much. And that's 2 o'clock, everybody. We want to thank all our speakers, all our participants, partners, all of you for joining us today. Please feel free to be in touch if you're interested in joining our collaborative effort to move these issues forward. We thank everybody again for their time today and look forward to being in touch. Have a great weekend, everybody.
And I see there's a variety of other questions out there in the chat, so I'll leave this contact information up for a few minutes so everyone can jot down that and send out those questions if you'd like.
And Ali Reza, I see a lot of questions about how they can get the PowerPoint. Did you mention that, how they will be able to access this?
It should be on the website.
Yes,
Great.
yeah, we'll be posting it on the website.
Yeah.
And
Yes.
this is Rachel. I just want to note and make sure that everyone saw in the chat box the examples of projects and cities that I've spoken with this week. I just added them in there if you need them as reference.
Thank you.
There's 2 people raising their hand right now, and might as well, while people are still on, gonna allow, let's see, Michael, let's see, go ahead. Did you have a quick question, Michael? Oh, wait, let's see.
Hey, yeah, hello?
Yes.
Hello?
Yes.
Yeah, my question was similarly echoed, but it was more so around this massive amounts of unrestricted capital inflows. So for context, when Forbes hosted the inaugural Opportunity Zone Summit in my hometown, Newark, New Jersey, we partnered in bringing local entrepreneurs in. And one of the areas that concerned me was Sean Parker discussing potentially $5 trillion of unrealized capital gains coming into these communities. But as we know, with venture capital, private equity, and the way that institutional capital is allocated thus far, a fraction of 1% going to people of color and women, who would stand up and advocate that policy mandate the inclusion, especially where displacement is an issue, of capital, including people of color, women, et cetera, and really reflecting the communities that it's pouring into.
Yeah, this is John. One of the things that a lot of larger communities have done is they've drawn up a big menu of local supports, whether it's for training or for transportation and other things. But there are to the degree that the overarching community can help to finance the sorts of priorities you're talking about in the context of what's happening more largely. I think perhaps a good bit can be done. I mean, it's not perfect in any way, but also I don't think we shouldn't assume that large amounts of money coming in are going to sort of blast the landscape bare and be in total control. I mean, these are local governments that have a lot of financing tools and partners, whether it's NGOs or local developers, that kind of thing, that can be supported and induced to act in the kinds of ways that you're referring to.
Is there one last question, Colton?
Sorry, I was on mute. Yes, I just unmuted Rosemary, so if you had a quick question as well. Or are you still on, Rosemary? She may have gotten off.
Yeah, sorry.
Okay.
I must have pressed the wrong button. I don't have a question right now.
Okay.
Okay, no problem.
No problem. All right, that's it for all of the raised hands at the moment.
Okay, great. Well, thank you again, everybody. Have a wonderful weekend, and we look forward to being in touch.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Bye-bye.
everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.
Abraham.